One of the fun things about sewing our own clothes is that we get to choose the type of finishes and the look that we want the end garment to be. I know, so that is the fun of sewing, and in this video we're going to talk through how to choose different hem types, so be it for a skirt, pants, top, anything, any hemming that you can better choose for depending on what kind of garment that you're making. You get to decide. Welcome back, my sewing friends. It is always such a delight to have you here. Welcome. My name is Evelyn Wood. I'm the creator of VintageSewingSchool.com. If you are very brand new here, welcome. And here on this channel, we do everything of the vintage sewing skills to help our modern day garment making so you can get better at making your own garments. If it's something you're interested in, do hit the subscribe button below because we have many more videos coming about this topic. Now, what we're talking about today is different hemming techniques. So my whole philosophy about sewing is that sewing is more than just picking up a pattern and copying it. That's not why we do this hobby. We start sewing because we want to create our own clothes. We want to decide what we want ourselves. And a lot of that is that you don't have to copy the sewing pattern. I want you to be able to make choices on what you want, how you want to construct the garment, what you want it to look like. This is all decisions you can make when you start to understand the skills of sewing and how to apply them to the garments that you're making. So it's stop copying the pattern and start deciding for yourself. Learn the skills of sewing so you can decide. This is the way I teach in Vintage Sewing School, and all my students attest to this, that it is how they create the garments that they want. And now the idea for this video came across because I did one very similar about seam finishes. I'll link this video down below, so how you can choose better seam finishes depending on what type of garment you're making. Today we're obviously talking about what type of hems to use for different types of garments and how you can choose, because the one that is listed on the pattern might not be the best one for what you're working on. Okay, so first of all, there are three factors that I usually use in deciding what hem to make. So it will depend on the fabric type, so whether it's a sheer, thick fabric, a woolly, fuzzy fabric, smooth, fine fabric, all these types of things factor in. The use of the garment. Is it a high active wear, something you'll be doing a lot of activity in? Is it something just a dress that you won't be moving much in at all? And the other is the garment style. Is it a curved circular hem? Is it a straight and narrow hem? The style of the garment also impacts it. We're going to come back to these three things later and we'll ask the questions around those. Right now, what we're going to talk about and what I want to run you through is the different types of hem choices that we actually have. Now, of course, I have simplified this and condensed it down to the most common ones so that we can just work through this together. Let's look at the type of hem choices between a small and narrow hem is one of the most common. You'll find this often double turned. It could just be overlocked or serged, turned up and stitched. Doesn't really matter the way, but a very small, thin, narrow hem is one option. Or then you actually have a larger hem where a lot more of the fabric is actually turned up and we have this really large band of hem. Again, you could use hemming tape like I have here. You could use just a double turn over the raw edges and encase it that way, and you could just overlock it, turn it up and stitch. All of that is to come. But we have a large and hem, so a fine and narrow or a large and heavy. Obviously with more fabric in here, it creates a bit more weight to the actual hem. So those are our two sort of, I guess, sizes. Then you obviously have a machine sew or hand sew choices. One we can do just on the machine, regular straight stitched, or the other is usually more invisible and hand stitch that hem. So now we have our hem choices. We know what we can choose. Let's come back to those three factors that we talked about earlier. Let's start with the fabric type. So with the fabric type affects what type of hem we might use. For example, a sheer fabric could be quite sort of semi see-through. And so you'll probably, any type of stitching that you do will be very noticeable. Any type of overlocking or serging underneath, you'll actually maybe see through it. So maybe you want a double turn or hem tapes and maybe encased more or not so large so you don't see that big strip underneath. So these types of things can affect the type of hem that you might do. And if you have a thicker fabric, again, the type of hem, a small narrow hem on a thick wool is near impossible to actually do. So you'll probably want to use a larger hem according to the weight of the fabric, because the heavier the fabric, the larger hem you'll probably need. The finer the fabric, you can do a really nice, small, tiny little narrow hem. So these types of factors come into what your thought consideration should be when choosing. And now the garment style is a big one, and I think where a lot of us make the wrong choices. I know I did. So the garment style, mostly concerned when we talk about hems is the garment straight and narrow? So our hemline is fairly square and straight, or is our hemline curved? Do we have a circular skirt, for example, where our hemline is curved? Because this is one of the biggest factors in what we need to decide our hems. So let me show you a large hem, for example. Now this one is already hemmed, but we can see this is a circular and it is curved. So it's not straight, it is a curved hem. And so the problem lies is when we turn this up, we're left with all of this extra bits. What do you do? And so the larger you go on a curved hem, the more this distorts and you just can't. Basically, because the measurement down here is larger, whenever you turn it up, this then hem is larger than what it's being sewn onto. And so you always have this issue. Now I do need to note that you have a few options when it comes to larger hems and what you can do to actually counteract this amount. So you can actually use tapes, so hemming tapes and such. Rayon hem tapes are my favorite to use, to actually use to ease in this extra fullness on this edge so it matches the one underneath. This is very common in vintage garments, and well, if it's good enough for the ladies of the past, it's good enough for me. Where we just, it's hard to see in black, but there's little pinches and tiny, tiny little tucks evenly through here, so it's easing in that fullness so it matches. That's one method of doing it. Even when we are, the other method is to use a hem facing. So you would actually, instead of turning this up and hemming it, you would actually cut and make yourself a facing piece to actually self-face the entire hem. That is my very favorite. That is when we look at thicker fabrics, that makes far more sense to use that method, because even turning it up, even with all of the easing and skill that we might have, you're still going to be prone to this. Because when we fold it up so much, the grain of the fabric, because of the curve, the bias is coming this way, and as it curves over, it's coming this way. So they always want to shift in different directions. There's just nothing you can do about that. And so there are a few options when you do come to larger hems to also consider in your repertoire of hemming skills. So this means that when you're looking at larger hems like this, really what you want is the smallest hem possible. So more like this one is going to be what you'll be looking at, where you've got just this tiny little turn up, because as we were just talking about, it's the more that you increase this that becomes an issue. So you'll want the smallest hem possible, and that difference between the edge here and where you're sewing it to is very, very minimal, and so you don't run into any problems. This goes for curved hems on skirts, particularly curved hems on shirt dresses, you know, where the hem on the blouse is curved up the side. Huge, everyone runs into those problems. You need to do as small as possible for curvy hems. And then on the other side, so our garment style, if we are quite square, like this one here, this is a nice straight skirt and is cut really sort of flat on the grain here. And then whenever I lift this up, I can do a really, really big hem, and it is just going to stay really nice and actually behave for me because it is just square. The difference between this one here and where it's being sewn to is very minimal, and so I can do a larger hem if I want, or you could still just do a tiny little one as well. You get to choose and decide. Now that factors in mostly the size. Let's talk, I think when we talk about the use of the garment, this is when, for me at least, it comes down to hand sewing versus machine sewing. So I always like to look at the garment after you've figured out the fabric type and thought about what might be appropriate. After you've thought about the style and how big your hem might actually be depending on their style. Then you think about the garment use. Is this going to be something you're very active in and moving around in? Is it something that is like workwear that you wear to work or do something in? Or is it just a fancy dress that you're only going to wear to dinner and you're sitting and eating and not doing much at all? This will factor in. So for me, sometimes, even though hand sewn is nice and invisible and beautiful and is usually my choice, for active garments that I know I'm going to be really active in, like stepping down and up and moving around a lot in, I find that, sometimes my heels and my shoes get caught in a hand sewn hem because it is slightly looser. And it's just not quite as hard wearing as, say, a machine sewn hem might be, of course. And so for me, that's when I also take those types of things into consideration as well when looking at what type of hem stitch to use. And of course then, do you want it to be visible or invisible? The use of it, if it's a more high-end type garment, you're more likely to end up wanting invisible finishes versus if it's something more active wear, a machine stitch might be acceptable. Of course, now remember that your pattern will have a hem allowance already made on that pattern. So you just have to make sure if you're going to go a larger hem or a smaller hem, you just either, for a larger hem, you might need to add some extra length to your pattern if need be, or if you want to make a smaller hem, you might actually trim some off, of course, and hem it as you normally would to allow for the right type of hem allowance, so how much you allowed for your hem for that particular pattern. Always just check the pattern that you're using when you're going to decide and go off pattern, as I like to call it. Just check before you make any radical changes. I do hope this gives you a new perspective on what to look for and things to actually tick off and consider when you're hemming. Remember, all this comes with practice. The more you do it, the more you'll know and the more you'll be familiar with making all these choices and the best choices. It's just practice, I promise. And now here is a promise that I would love to hear from you. I would love to hear from you. Next time, I want you to promise me, next time you in a pattern and you're midway through the instructions and it just says hem the bottom, turn up and stitch, you think to yourself, what kind of hem do I want? Do I want it actually bigger and heavier? Remember, the larger hem adds a bit more weight to it as well. Rather than being a tiny little one, you might want your skirt hem to have a bit more weight to it and hence have a larger hem. Maybe turn it over twice in there and it's heavier again. That's a big factor in skirt hems. You decide what you want for yourself as well. And I want you to come back and tag me on social media and tell me how you were able to choose the hem choice that you actually wanted, not just what the pattern told you to use. I so look forward to that. So tell me, my sewing friends, what has been your biggest struggle with hemming? Or how are you going to use these tips that I've talked about today in this video? How are you going to apply them to make better choices in your hemming next time? That I would be really interested to know. So until then, my sewing friends, happy sewing. Bye.